I really believe that if I had heard someone with a story similar to mine when I was struggling that badly, that something would have clicked and I would have realized like, oh my gosh, I need to speak up. Like this person's been through it and is telling me like, even after all of this, speaking up is what has gotten him through this stuff. And I think that's going to save lives.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the We're Not Stumped podcast. I'm your host, Mike Bolland, and today I welcome Zach Tidwell. Zach always knew he wanted to be a Marine, but there were some circumstances that went through his life and things kind of changed for him. And we're going to get into that story. He's going to tell that story. I'm really interested in hearing more about it. And we're going to do that today on the podcast. But first of all, Zach, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to be on the We're Not Stumped podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
I can't wait to learn much more about you. I've done a lot of reading already, and what a story. We always start the podcast with a segment I call In Your Own Words. So, Zach, I'd love for you to tell your story and have the audience know a little bit more about you.
All right, I'll try and keep this as short as possible, but I am a Marine Corps vet. I served as a machine gunner for 4 years and deployed twice, but thankfully never saw combat. But a bad combination of personal circumstances and head injuries and a lack of healthy coping skills led me down a really bad path. And about 9 months after I was discharged from the Marines, I decided that I didn't want to be alive anymore, and I shot myself between the eyes. So today I'm completely blind and deaf in one ear, but after having had to relearn how to do literally everything, I own my own business as a self-taught, award-winning software developer, making the digital world a more accessible place for everyone. I'm a writer, I'm a speaker, and I'm an athlete. So I ski and rock climb and whitewater kayak and surf and skydive and compete in Brazilian jiu-jitsu against people without any disabilities. And I do stuff like this in hopes of keeping other people from going down the same path that I did.
Well, you also are a new podcaster, which is very exciting. Going in blind
Yeah.
with Zach Tidwell, and I know it's relatively new, but I want people to make sure they know how to get there and give you support. It's available, I would imagine, on all the major platforms.
Yeah, it's on YouTube and then all of basically anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find it there.
That's exciting. And what is the theme? Are you gonna have people on that you're gonna interview? You're gonna maybe tell a little bit more about your story, a little bit of both?
It's all supposed to be conversations with interesting people doing interesting things. And it's anywhere from people researching to people with unique jobs to other people with stories of overcoming. The first guest was the co-founder and executive director of a nonprofit that I use for whitewater kayaking. I've got a former NFL player coming on soon who's had 9 brain surgeries from all of the head trauma that he experienced while he was playing. I've got a Navy SEAL coming on soon, a guy who was on Shark Tank. It's supposed to be these long form conversations, really diving into people's stories and their lessons that they've learned or whatever work they're doing that's impacting others.
Well, that one you were talking about with the NFL, the gentleman from the NFL. First of all, I'm going to be listening to all of these. They sound very excited or very interesting. I don't want to say exciting. It depends on the story, but that's something I believe that you also share to a certain extent with that NFL player with the brain injury you talked about a little earlier. What was that journey like for you?
It's so I had head injuries. I'd had concussions growing up. I've played sports year round my entire life. So I wasn't a stranger to getting rocked, but I was in a motorcycle accident in March of 2018, which was about 5 months before I finished my enlistment in the Marines, where I still have really no memory of what happened. Everything that I know of is filled in from other people and the kind of shenanigans that ensued afterwards. But I, it was by far the worst concussion that I've ever had because the lack of memory and it it's common to have light sensitivity and nausea and be puking and have headaches and these prolonged headaches and the fogginess and things like that after head injuries, but severe ones can totally change your personality and affect the hormones in your brain. I mean, it can affect men's testosterone levels. I'm not sure if it can affect women's. or not, but these are issues that we're seeing more and more research about. And part of the reason I'm so excited to have that former football player on my show, we're gonna have a lot to talk about. But for me, I didn't realize how much it had affected me because I wasn't in a great spot when it happened. So my wife had been cheating on me on my second deployment in the Marines. And I found out in late 2017 while I was still deployed, came home in November, tried to make things work, and it didn't. And I filed for divorce in January, I believe, of 2018. And the motorcycle accident was in March. So when I felt so depressed after the motorcycle accident, I thought it was just an extension of that, but I had been dealing with it before that. I wasn't in a good spot, but I was keeping myself busy and I was dealing with it in a healthy manner. After the motorcycle accident, I kind of fell into a pit of depression, and instead of speaking up about it, my solution was to drink because I couldn't sleep. And I noticed that if the more I drank before I went to bed, the longer I would at least stay asleep. I might go from sleeping for 2 hours that night to three, or, 3 to 3.5. And then I'd still wake up in the middle of the night, but I got an extra hour, or maybe I slept for 4 hours. But people who don't have the professional level of drinking experience that I do don't realize that when you drink yourself into oblivion like that, you're not actually getting any quality sleep because your body is trying to process the alcohol out of your system. But in addition to all that, I became very agitative and impulsive. Like just little tiny things, really inconsequential things would make me very abrasive. And I was not a fun person to be around, but I was an infantryman in the Marines and I kept my mouth shut. And so me being grumpy didn't really stand out that much. But I got out of the Marines in August of 2018 and started working full time and going to school full time I was keeping up appearances to everyone that I was doing all right, to the extent that even when I was so apathetic that I didn't want to be doing anything, still showing up to work. I was getting straight A's in school and working out. But like I would try dragging myself out of the house to do things, and I realized that I didn't want to do them. So like I've always been a big snowboarder. So I would drive a couple hours out up to the mountains to go snowboard and like not want to be there. But I would stay there and sit in my truck so that it looked like I'd gone snowboarding that day. And then I'd drive a couple hours back home. And I did the same thing going to the racetrack, or I was just hiding all this stuff while instead I would come home and try and self-medicate with alcohol. And it eventually caught up with me. Like I said, on March 31st of 2019, I had reached the point where I didn't want to be here anymore. And I had decided 4 days beforehand that I was going to shoot myself. Like that was me. I felt like there was no other escape. And I was stone cold sober 4 days beforehand. I cleared my gun out and held it to my head and knew, like, okay, this is my ticket out. And 4 days later, I did it.
And how long were you out? Basically, was that what was the last thing you remember? And then what do you remember waking up?
It's it's really fuzzy now, but the day beforehand, my parents had visited me and my little sisters and thought I was a little grumpy and tired, but I was working full time and going to school full time. And like I said, I was genuinely just grumpy all the time at that point. So that didn't really stand out. But the day of, on March 31st, I'm not sure how much of this is me remembering it now versus like me piecing it together from what I've been told. But I had decided that making a suicide video, like an apology video, was more personal than writing a note. So I was doing that, and my roommate, because I had a two-bedroom apartment with a buddy that I'd gone to high school with at the time, he got home early from work. So I paused the video and went out and talked to him while he was cooking dinner, like nothing was wrong. And it's like, hey man, how was work? Are you gonna be on Xbox later? Cool. Yeah, yeah, I'll be on after I finish cooking dinner and doing my dishes. So I went back to my room. Eventually he went back to his, and shortly he went back to his, he heard the gunshot. He didn't realize it was a gunshot, but eventually when he came into my room, I was laying on the bed with a bullet hole in my forehead. And he called 911, and I guess I woke up during it. And I was asking for help and water. And I was so out of it, I guess, that I was combative on the way to the hospital. So they actually had to put me out and they put me on life support. And I don't know how long I was out, but when they brought me to, I was so messed up from a combination of probably the concussive force of it all and all the meds that I had been on that I didn't know I was blind because I could have a conversation like we were having right now, but
Hmm.
and I couldn't see you, but I was seeing these just wildly vivid hallucinations of settings, like if places that really didn't make sense. But again, I was so just not with it that didn't click to me that that wasn't real. So it was pretty wild. But I was in the hospital for 51 days in total.
And when you were describing the sleeping part, that one kind of fascinated me because I've kind of battled some things myself, but nothing like you have. So nothing even close, believe me. But as far as when you're saying that the alcohol and you're doing it so you could sleep, was it one of those things that was more just so your mind would turn off for 3 hours, whether you're getting good sleep or not?
Yeah, and that's essentially I'm sure we'll probably talk about this, but alcoholism became part of my story after I was blind too. And it really is. I mean, when people have an issue like that, whatever substance it is, it usually is they're seeking an escape from something. It's so you don't have to deal with it. Your coping mechanism is to turn it off, and that's exactly what I was doing. I don't think I realized that at the time,
Hmm.
but yeah, that is what I was doing.
And this is both before and after your suicide attempt?
Yeah, so leading up to my suicide attempt, that is absolutely what was happening. It was the majority of nights. It wasn't every night, but I was drinking a lot. And it became an issue, I think I want to say in 2021 is when that kicked off my in the middle of 2021 is when it kicked off the 2.5 years of alcoholism that I'm a little over a year sober now, but um I hadn't realized I wasn't self-aware enough and hadn't realized like I thought alcoholics were people who, you see passed out on a
Hmm.
bus covered in their own pee.
Hmm.
And because I'd gone without alcohol for a while after I shot myself and then eventually was able to have a drink or two here and there socially, that wasn't me, but eventually it's like when I drank to cope with something one night that I was very frustrated with when I after I was back in college. It was just digital accessibility issues. It was a silly thing to drink over, but I was like, oh, I'm gonna blow off some steam. It was innocent at the time, and but it like unlocked whatever had I like basically where I had stopped at before, I just picked that right back up. So
Wow. And again, I want to remind everyone we're talking to Zach Tidwell, and I know that you have a lot of different. You're on social media, yeah. But what's the best way? If like, what's your website? Do you have a website that people can go to that everything's going to branch out, including the Going In Blind, your podcast?
yeah, my website is zachtidwell.net, but outside of that, the podcast is everywhere. And
Yeah.
again, that's like you said, going in blind with Zach Tidwell.
You had mentioned that you got a little frustrated because of the accessibility, which is understandable. And but you are also, as you said a little earlier, you're developing software as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So that's actually where that stemmed from. After I was back in college about 9 months after I shot myself, and I started going for clinical psychology and was able to, from the beginning of 2020 through about the middle of 2021, was able to do all of my assignments because it had been nothing had been math or science based. I'd had all those prereqs done from before I shot myself, but I reached a statistics for clinical research class and nothing about the class was accessible. And
Hmm.
basically the school assigned someone to be my eyeballs instead of making like converting everything like they were supposed to.
Yeah.
And that it was very frustrating for me because I was totally independent at this point. I bought my first house. I was living on my own. I could ski and rock climb and do all these other things. But if you sat a math homework assignment in front of me, I couldn't be independent. And that's just whatever, for whatever reason, is a hot button topic for me. And
Hmm.
so after I took my first exam in that class was when I ordered that alcohol. That wasn't good, and it wound up with me self-admitting to the VA hospital because I was drunk and suicidal. And
Hmm.
after I got out of there, I started researching what causes those issues. Like, how come I can pay my mortgage but not do my math homework? How come I can get on Audible and listen to an audiobook but not pay my HOA? And
Hmm.
that's when I found out it all comes down to the code running behind the scenes of each app or website. Like, developers have to take steps to make things accessible for people who use access technologies, whether that's magnification or the screen reading software that I use, or voice control stuff for people who have mobility impairments. And I decided that I was going to become part of the solution. So I dropped out of college and started teaching myself how to code. And that I started that in October of 2021. My first app came out on the 4th of July in 2023, and it won a couple Game of the Year awards for its level of accessibility. And I just had the opportunity to speak at the Game Accessibility Conference back in, I think it was November. It was October or November, but the like AAA game studios from around the world come to these conferences for this to learn about all this stuff and talk about the work that they're doing. And they had me speak there because of, I mean, what I what I did was substantial. And so
Yeah.
I'm continuing to do that stuff. And now I'm working on something in the education space to hopefully address some of the issues that I had while I was in college for other people.
Ah, that's fantastic. Are those apps still available?
I just pulled that first app was called Xanagrams, and I just pulled it off the App Store a couple of weeks ago because between the book, the podcast, speaking engagements, and getting my own podcast off the ground, I just didn't have time to keep up with it.
Oh,
So
really? Come on. I mean, you don't have anything
no,
going. And then your
you
sports.
yeah. So I've been a little busy, but the next one I'm pretty far into development on it right now. So I'm really bad at trying to predict timelines for the software development stuff because it is so open-ended, but it'll be plastered all over my social media as I get closer.
I want to talk about everything you got going on right now, but before we get there, how did you get to the place where you were able to go, you know what, I'm going to make a difference, as you said, and then write a book and have a podcast and write code so you can get accessible software? What was the turning point for you to be able to do that? Because there's people listening that are at the other side.
It really, like I said, that in that summer of 21 is when the drinking started. So, and I started teaching myself how to code in October. I mean, that was a very short between the two. They were directly correlated. Like I said, there was that kind of downfall when alcoholism started, but that led to me researching those issues and then deciding that I was going to teach myself. And so between October of 21 and the 4th of July in 23, I treated that like a full-time job. I
Hmm.
mean, and it was all just from Googling and reading articles online. And I taught myself and started that company that's called Dark Horse Game Studios. And I'll have more stuff that comes out with that company in the future. But that I started making progress in terms like with my alcoholism after Xanagrams came out and in July of 23 because for me that was, even though I'm being a piece of crap and struggling with the alcoholism, I was trying to get sober. I could not figure it out. I was that entire time I was trying to stop drinking, and it was just, I mean, I was in the middle of an addiction and I couldn't figure out how to string any time together. And looking back on it now, I think a lot of it was because I didn't have a purpose or an identity. I had lost all of that when I shot myself. You know, I was a machine gunner in the Marine Corps, and that was my identity. I was this strong, independent dude who could take anything that was thrown at him. And then I shot myself in the face, and all of a sudden I was dependent on everyone around me. And for a while, gaining my independence back was huge. So like that was my one goal. And so I was snowboarding 8.5 months after I shot myself, and then I was in college, and then I was back out on my own 6 months after that. And then it was like everything kind of stalled. And then I started struggling with the alcoholism. But as I was building this software, when it finally came out, like it got recognized immediately and was getting hyped up. And that's when I started doing podcasts and actually speaking about my story. And it was like, okay, now I've come full circle. I've put something back out into the world that is going to help someone else because everything that post Marine Corps and even joining the Marine Corps infantry, that is, hey, you're serving. I wanted to be an ER nurse. That is serving others. And then I was trying to go to school for clinical psychology. That is serving others. Like when it came full circle with the software coming out, again, I'd found a way that I could help other people and I had done something. I'd put something into the world. I felt like, okay, this is my new identity and this is my new purpose. I get value out of this. And now, there's been a continuation of my story now. Now I'm not the guy who shot himself in the face and everything kind of ended for him. I've moved on. And so I strung together like a month of sobriety and then kind of fell off the wagon. And then I strung together like 2.5 months of sobriety and then I fell off the wagon. And now I haven't had a drink since December 5th of 2022. Or no,
Wow.
2023. It's 2025 now. So
Yeah.
since December 5th of 2023. And I started writing the book in January, I think on January 18th of 2024, because it was obvious like, okay, I'm making progress. I'm doing better mentally here. I'm going to get sober. And now that I am, I feel qualified to share all of this stuff because I've been through so much, including I got diagnosed with Huntington's disease, which is an incurable genetic disease that will eventually cause me to be a vegetable unless
Wow.
there are medical advancements sometime before I start to show symptoms. And oh, I most likely have a lot of time until I start showing symptoms just based off of my family history with it. But there's been a lot of stuff. And despite that, I'm still in a really good place now where I'm in this positive place. I feel happy. I'm sober. And I've learned a lot of really good coping skills along the way. And all this stuff has been deliberate work on myself. And now that I'm finally sober, I'm walking the walk. I felt validated in the fact that I could write this book. And so I did, and I finished the first draft of it on Thanksgiving. I'm working through the second draft of it right now, and progress is coming along pretty well with that. So we'll see. Again, timelines are tough with stuff like this, but I sit down and write every day. That's the very first thing that I do, and progress is coming along. But it's a memoir that really dives into everything that I did wrong because ultimately I'm the only one responsible for where I wound up. When I pulled that trigger, that was because I chose not to speak up and I chose to be weak and drink instead of confronting what I was dealing with, which is kind of ironic because I thought that speaking up was weak at the time,
Hmm.
but
Wow.
dives into all of that stuff. And then, it's been almost 6 years since I shot myself now. I've accomplished a lot in that time. And as you kind of hinted at, I've got a lot of big things coming, but there's been a lot of struggle in between. And a lot of people miss that. They see where I am now compared to 6 years ago. And you're like, man, there's, that comeback story that it's like a glow up story, but people don't realize like it's been a struggle in between. And I think that's very important to touch on, especially because these are all very relevant issues that a lot of people deal with. But a lot of it's embarrassing. So it's it'll be interesting to kind of explore once the book comes out.
Well, between your podcast and the book, there's no question you're going to help many people. And you had said something that really stuck with me. Making sure that you feel like you have a purpose is something that is a key to, it seems like, a lot of your success. Is that accurate, or was I just taking a little bit too much out of that statement?
No, that's very I you kind of hit the nail on the head with it. I don't even know how much I realized it until I was writing the book. As I hit that point in my story, and as you could probably imagine, it has dragged up a lot of stuff where I was like, "Oh, I guess I haven't really dealt with that. I thought I was past that, and I'm not." And I feel like I've dealt with a lot of it now. But as I was trying to kind of put those realizations to the page, I did. I realized that that is what it was, and I think part of that's the way that I was raised. I'm very task oriented and driven and hold myself to a very high standard. And I think having something to accomplish like that, like each day that I know I need to knock out, and I've reestablished what that is for me. And that, for whatever reason, between that and being very, very physically active keeps me sane and keeps me in a healthy spot and keeps me on the straight and narrow.
Was that another learning? Understand, well, certainly being a blind athlete, but yeah, I'm sure you had to learn that. But there's even, I don't know, limitations isn't the right word, but limited resources, as opposed to like an able-bodied athlete, I would imagine. Was that a whole new learning experience? Because I know within the amputee community, it certainly is. I would imagine in yours too.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely very fortunate in the fact that I'm a veteran. I mean, there's a lot of veteran exclusive programs out there. So
Hmm.
I can't speak to the civilian side of it. And
Hmm.
honestly, I think probably every adaptive program that I've participated in has been for vets. So I'm not sure what the disparity is in terms of numbers for opportunities because I haven't looked. I
Hmm.
relate to veterans. I have a very dark sense of humor, so that's typically better around veterans. But um, so it's but that was very early on. Once I found out that that was a thing, like I was snowboarding 8.5 months after I shot myself, and that was before I knew how to cook for myself or anything. Like but that was I used to snowboard and getting back out on the slopes and was like my first taste of independence again. And so that was like, I am going to chase this stuff. I'm going to get back into this stuff. And between that and the goal of getting back out on my own, which came, 7 months after I'd been snowboarding, they were huge driving forces for me. And again, I think some of that was proving to myself that I hadn't totally screwed my life by shooting
Hmm.
myself,
Hmm.
and that, if I had been blinded by an accident, that's very different than at my own hand. Like in my eyes, that's a lot easier to swallow because this was all my fault that I wound up in this terrible spot where I am now disabled for the rest of my life. But they've absolutely, I would say the biggest thing in terms of finding opportunities is for weird stuff like Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Like I had trouble finding a gym that would work with me initially. Once I did, it was fine. And a lot of that stuff is even, like finding rock climbing partners. I think people, obviously, I can't see their faces, but they probably look at me a little funny when I'm like, hey, I rock climb and stuff like that. And it, it tends, or it seems to tend to be people who haven't been around others with disabilities.
Hmm.
Eh, But sometimes it takes a little bit to break down the assumption that I can't do any of this stuff. But outside of that, man, a lot of this stuff is just bugging people and being like, "Hey, I can do this. I need you to take a chance on me."
Well, it's interesting, like visualizing you snowboarding. I was on the Pro Bowlers Tour back in the day, and right now I volunteer for Arizona Disabled Sports, which is a bunch
Mhm.
of different disabled, dis disabilities, I guess, and including blind. And we set up a rail so they know where they're at on the lane. And I never knew that. Even as a bowler, as long as I used to bowl back in the day, I never knew that that was something. So when I'm trying to visualize you as a snowboarder, how does that work? Again, if you don't mind me asking, I'm just kind of curious how that all works.
It's funny. So, because I know another blind vet who's got both of his ears and he follows a cowbell down the mountain and he'll
Wow.
ski the most advanced terrain on the mountain, following the sound, just the cling, 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 cling
Yeah.
of a cowbell all day.
Yeah.
Um, I
Wow.
only have one ear, and when there's background noise, like skis
Yeah.
cutting through ice or along the snow or the wind, I really can't follow sound. So we actually use radios. And
That's awesome.
my guides will ride some distance behind me and be like, hey, we've got to traverse 100 yards here on the cat track, but we're going to drop into to a black groomer and we're going to drop in on the upper right side. So when you drop in, hang a left and I'll tell you when you're centered. And so I'll drop in and as soon as I do, I can feel the pitch because they're steep and I'll just hold a turn until they tell me I'm centered. And once I am, they just cut me loose and I can go by feel. And, every once in a while I start drifting too far to one side as I'm making my turns and making my way down the mountain, or I start going too fast and they need me to dump some speed because we're about to come to a pitch change, or, someone is falling down in front of me or something. But it's it's independent mostly once you're on the pitch like that. And it's all, they just call stuff out. It's the same way when I whitewater kayak, it's the same thing. In my own kayak, we have radios and my guide is behind me talking through the radios and they have to be more hands-on because they have to set you up for success going into these rapids. But they try and line you up, and then if something goes wrong, you end up upside down. And I know how to flip a kayak, so I roll back up, and then I can hear him screaming in my ear like, "Paddle, paddle, 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 go right." And it's chaos, but it's so much fun. And other stuff like the rock climbing is just you just got to get me to the rock face, and then I'm independent. And jujitsu, I compete against people without ability. The only change is typically you start a couple feet apart when you're standing and we start touching, but
Mm.
I get the same grips that the person without the disability does. So it's even. We just start a little differently. And they also won't let someone disconnect from me and just like try and silently walk around me. They'll reconnect us if something like that happens, but it's pretty neat.
Wow, it really sounds like it. All the things you're doing. Is there any other sport that we didn't bring up? Because this is fascinating to me.
Uh, I learned how to surf last year. That's
Wow.
It is so because I snowboarded when I could see, but surfing is very different in that, there's a lot when you pressure on, you're still trying to use edges just like you would on a snowboard. But it's interesting because, when you lean back into a mountain with snow, there's a lot, you're hitting like a hard surface. Whereas on the surfboard, like when you're trying to turn, which I don't really turn when I surf, I'm pretty much just riding straight. I'm not very good. I've only gone a couple times now, but um, the water just gives. It's like it's this totally different thing, but between the sounds of the water and you feel like these different phases of the wave that trigger like, okay, I know I'm about to get a second push, and after this water kind of settles out, now I need to stand because the real rest of the wave is coming and I'm going to catch it. And I it's it was so much more fun than I expected. And then, the least adaptive required thing is skydiving. I mean, for tandem skydiving, you're strapped to someone's chest and you kind of just have to fall forward out of a plane. So it's pretty easy, but yeah.
I'm trying to think if there's anything that you've done that I haven't. I think it's zero. You've done way more than I ever have. That's amazing. And let me ask you this, though. How important do you feel fitness and sports are for the recovery or just like within the limb loss community? It's pretty damn important to make sure that you're keep moving and it's good for the mind, body, and soul. Is that the same for your situation?
Yeah, I work out every day, like without question.
Yeah.
I lift weights 6 days a week, and then I do a long, like hour-long Peloton ride on the day that I don't lift, and then I hit Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu classes 3 or 4 days a week as well. It's just when I've worn myself out physically, I feel like it sets me up better to handle things mentally.
Hmm.
And I think part of that is doing hard things. Like when you are, it's Joe Rogan that I heard say this. I think he calls it voluntary adversity. When you're choosing to put yourself in uncomfortable spots all the time, like when something that you haven't chosen to subject yourself to comes along, it's just kind of like, meh, because I've been doing harder stuff every day anyways. And that seems to just, I mean, if I don't work out, I don't feel good. It's just that for me personally, and I think people who don't already have that baseline don't understand the positive effects of that. But, if you don't do anything, you can start with just going on walks. It's,
Yeah.
you will notice a difference.
That's a great point. I completely agree with you. That's really helps me out quite a bit. I certainly got my workout in today. I've made my own prosthetics because it's like I need to work out.
What?
Yeah, I made them out of PVC and things like that, just because I don't have a hand, so it's like no,
Yeah.
I'm going to do something. I don't have, and push-ups aren't that hard necessarily, but working out. To your point, I love everything you said about it. What are you looking forward to? You have so much going on, so this is one of those questions that I generally ask, but I'm thinking, gosh, is this a fair question because he's got so much on his plate? But what are you looking forward to in the future? What any other activities, things, books? Certainly the podcast. What are you looking forward to in the future to continue to do or do new?
Gosh, I'm trying to decide on something here. Definitely the book is something that I'm very excited to hopefully. So I haven't let anyone read it yet. I'm going to after the second draft. I'm gonna actually let people read it and rip it apart and then refine it and take it to an editor and start trying to get it published. But that's still a long process. I want to start. I've gotten to do more speaking opportunities, but really, especially as the book comes out, that will be something that I'm making a bigger push for. And because I think, and I think you and I discussed this offline before we
Hmm.
started recording, but I really believe that if I had heard someone with a story similar to mine when I was struggling that badly, that something would have clicked and I would have realized like, oh my gosh, I need to speak up. Like this person's been through it and is telling me like, even after all of this, speaking up is what has gotten him through this stuff. And I think that's going to save lives. And I also think talking about all this stuff that I've been through and where I am despite that can help put things in perspective for people who are struggling but aren't at such a drastic point. Where you're like, okay, you know what? It can be worse. And here's some of the things that he's done that have worked for him. I'm going to start working out. Not every day,
Hmm.
but I'll start working out 3 times a week or something. And
Hmm.
there's so many little actionable things that I think are can really be captured in these conversations that I just the more impact I can have in keeping other people from going down the same path that I did and opening up these conversations that tend to be uncomfortable for people and are avoided. That's my big focus right now. Of course, I'm excited about everything else and the software development stuff
Oh yeah.
and all that, but I would
And
say
the
those are my
sports and the book. Got a
yeah,
couple things
but
going.
I think that's the most impact that I can have, if
Well,
that
I
makes
don't think
sense.
it absolutely does, and I think you've already impacted people, but you are going to continue to do that with your book, and certainly one other time I want to say this is Zach Tidwell with Going In Blind. He has that podcast, Going In Blind with Zach Tidwell. Go look it up. Go listen to it. Zach, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Your story is one of I'm in amazement listening to you, and congratulations on everything you're doing, and again, thank you for your time. It really means a lot to me.
Yeah, thanks for letting me sit here and give my spiel.
Love it. Thank you for listening to this episode of the We're Not Stumped podcast. I have an ask for everyone that got to this point of the podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe. The reason is simple. These stories need to be shared. It would help it to get out there to the people that really need to hear these stories.